we shall commence this module by discussing the growth story of India in brief. Since the Industrial Revolution, no country has become a major economy without becoming an industrial power. Lee Kuan Yew in a lecture in 2005 had said this thing. However, India's growth story is seen as a paradox to this structural transformation due to the relatively poor performance of the manufacturing sector as compared to the robust march of the service sector. According to the Central Statistics Office, the growth rate of GDP in India for the period 2014-15 was 7.3%, while the World Bank, with an expected growth rate of 7.5%, has forecasted that India is set to surpass China for the first time by the end of this fiscal year. Now, India's GDP has slowed down substantially from 10.6% in 2010 to 7.2% in 2011, but it was still higher than the growth rate of emerging economies, which was only 6.2%. However, the growth of the service sector in India, its rising share in GDP and its contribution to trade and investment has attracted global considerations. Service sector is the second largest employer and also accounts for the largest share in India's foreign direct investment inflows as well as outflows. In many countries, the economic growth is led by the shift from agriculture to the industries, while India is considered as an outliner according to Ansari in 1995, because it has seen a shift from agriculture to the service sector. Here it is to be noted that service sector grew more slowly than the industry between 1951 and 1990, but the growth in the service sector accelerated in 1990s when it averaged 7.5% in a year, while the industry and the agriculture grew on an average by 5.8% and 3.1% respectively. Further, as measured in terms of the coefficient of variation, the growth in the service sector has relatively been stable as compared to the growth in the industry and agriculture. The development of service sector as the most vital sector of the Indian economy has been dramatic in many ways. The pickup in 1990s was the strongest in the business services, communication and banking services, followed by hotels and restaurants. While the most observable and prominent element of the rise of service sector has been in the software and information technology, but the spectrum of growth in services has been wider than the rise in the information technology. The literature on growth shows that as an economy matures, the share of services in the GDP rises consistently. In line with the trend, India has witnessed a decline in the share of agriculture in GDP and an increase in the share of industry and services. During the period of 1952-2000, the share of agriculture in GDP has fallen from 58 to 25%, while the share of industry has increased from 15 to 27%, and that of the services sector has increased from 27 to 48%. Here it is very important to note that during 1990s, the share of services in India's GDP climbed by about 8% point, while that of industry remained constant. It has been observed that liberalization and reforms are the two important factors for the growth of the services sector in India, according to Chandra in 2002. There also has been a change in consumption pattern from essential commodities to the discretionary demand like education, personal and health services due to the rise in per capita income. High income elasticity of demand for services, technological progress and availability of skilled manpower has led to the growth of the service sector. India was considered as the best place to outsource the services by the developed countries, which added to the demand for the service sector in India. After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the importance of service sector in the Indian economy, know the reasons that led to the growth of the service sector, address the issue of sustainability of growth process led by the service sector. Let us now begin our discussion about the share of services in the gross domestic product. There are two stages in development. In the first, share of services and industry increases as the countries progress, while in the second stage, the share of industry declines and that of services increases as the economy is transformed into the higher income level. India's growth story follows a similar pattern. In the period 1950 to 1990, the share of agriculture in GDP declined by about 25 percentage points, while the industry and services captured the share in equal proportion. However, the share of industry has been constant since 1990 and the whole decline in the share of agriculture has been taken up by the services sector in this period. At the current level, India's services share of GDP is higher than the average for the other low income countries. However, closer examination of the data suggests that the whole issue of increase in share of service sector in GDP has been overblown. It has not always been the case that the services have been growing faster than the industry. Between the period 1950-51 and 1980-81, industry grew by an annual average of 5.3%, while the services grew by a slower 4.4%. This began to change since 1980 when the service sector growth at 6.5% outpaced the industry growth rate of 6%. The maximum divergence was seen between 1991 and 2000 when the services grew promptly as compared to the industrial sector. As a consequence, the share of industry in GDP fell marginally. In the last decade, the share of the services in the GDP has outpaced the combined share of agriculture and industries. In 2009 and 10, services, industries and agriculture respectively accounted for 57.3%, 25.7% and 16.9% of India's GDP. Nevertheless, the share of services is lower than that of the developed countries like the United Kingdoms and the United States, but higher than that of China. The divergence in the growth rate of the industry and the agriculture was not too significant till 2010, but it has increased sharply in the period 2011 and 13. Thus, many economists argue that India's faster growth in the services and its 55% share of GDP is unnatural in a low income economy. It is in the sense that India is perceived to be an outliner. It is to be noted that even during the global slowdown, service sector of India remained stable. In 2009 and 10, services grew at 9.96% as compared to 8.81% growth in the industries and 1.57% in the agriculture. However, in the same period, variations can be seen in the performance of the services sector in the various states of India. The share of the services in the state gross domestic product was higher in the states like Bihar, Delhi, Kerala, Mizoram and West Bengal as compared to the all India average, while that of Chhattisgarh and Himachal Pradesh was the lowest. The share of the services sector in GSDP was high for the states like Nagaland and Tripura, but it is expected to fall because growth rate of the services in these states is low. The growth rate of services is also low for the states such as Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Rajasthan and Nagaland than the all India level, while that of Arunachal Pradesh and Sikkim was higher. Next, we shall discuss the share of the services in employment. A noticeable trait of India's growth is that when there has been a substantial decline in the share of agriculture in GDP, a change in the share of employment has been rather little. Paradoxically, the share of the services in the employment declined by about 1 percentage point during 1990s, and exactly during this time the share of services in GDP rose from 42% to 48%. Thus, while the production of output has shifted to services from agriculture, the generation of employment in services has encountered difficulty. It is unlike the experience of other countries, as India is witnessing a relatively jobless service sector growth and it has exceptionally low share of service employment when compared with the other countries. Thus, there has been a lot of debate on the employment generating capacity of the service sector. Looking at both the organized as well as the unorganized sector, in 1993-94, agriculture engaged 63% of the population, while the services employed just 21% of the population. Since then, the broad pattern has remained the same, with agriculture having the highest share, though the percentage of people employed in agriculture has declined marginally and a little increase in the employment in the service sector has been seen. The retail sector has played a significant role in the services sector employment and its share is still rising. The share of the transport, storage and communication is also increasing. However, the share of defense has declined. Further, it is to be noted that in 2009 and 10, within the services sector, over 80% of the employment was in the unorganized sector. Subsectors like retail and wholesale trade provide the unorganized employment, while the services like the finance, insurance, real estate and the social and personal services largely provide organized sector employment. Of the total organized employment, public sector has the share of 86% in 1993-94, which declined to 75% in 2009 and 10. Hotels and trade is the only sector where the private sector employment is higher than the public sector employment. Among the states, Delhi and Kerala have the highest share in the organized employment. Thus, we can conclude that the employment in the services sector is low in India as compared to the share of the service sector in GDP is growing. Within services, the share of the organized sector employment is still small. However, within the organized service sector, the public sector dominates the employment in the services, and thus the private sector has not been very successful in creating the organized services sector employment. Moving on to discuss the reasons explaining the growth of the services sector. A number of studies have attempted to explain the fast growth in the share of the services in cross-country analysis. One of the early explanations given for the service growth was the notion of splintering. This means manufacturers outsource the non-core functions like safety guards, drivers and canteen staff to the other firms in order to keep the cost down. This resulted in the services industry getting a fresh impetus. Changes in the production technique can also cause a firm to splinter, and as a result, the proportion of the output generating in service sector tends to increase. Such splintering is seen in the increase in the use of services as intermediate inputs rather than as the final demand. However, it is to be noted that in 1990s, the fastest growing services activities were final consumption of communication and hotels and restaurants, and this shows that the splintering have played a less significant role in boosting up of the growth in the 1990s. The changes in the use of service sector as inputs do not appear to have grown in 1990s, and thus the usage of the service as the input in the other sectors is just partly responsible for the increase in the services share in the GDP. The second reason can be the demand side impetus. Since 1951, the share of the services sector in the private final consumption expenditure has almost tripled. Till the liberalization of the early 1990s, the share of services in total private final consumption expenditure was stagnant. However, this changed abruptly as the share of the services in the total private consumption went up to 31% in 2000-2001 and further to 39% in 2006 and 7. Dividing the demand for the services into subsectors, we find that private expenditure on the education alone has increased from rupees 1558 crore in 1980-81 to rupees 55,145 crores in 2006 and 7 at the current prices. The rising demand for the education, especially from the poor, will ensure that this remains a driver of the GDP growth in the future. Similarly, the private expenditure on communications rose from a mere rupees 522 crores in 1980-81 to rupees 61,655 crores in 2006 and 7. Expenditure on health services and medical care has also increased from 3,434 crores in 1980-81 to rupees 64,777 crores in 2000-2001 and then rupees 1,02,422 crores in 2006 and 7. Moving forward, we also recognize that the service sector, especially the information technology, is not restricted by the fetters imposed by the government as being done on the manufacturing activities. These shackles can be seen in terms of licensed capacity limits, technology denial in the name of self-reliance, location policy directives and the foreign exchange controls. It is also to be noted that the government made computer import inexpensive and less time consuming by changing the rules. Looking at the financial conditions, we find that IT firms enjoy a 30% margin sales on routine basis. This extension of profitability is vastly greater than that of the manufacturing companies. We find this in telecommunication sector as well, where the call charge of rupees 16 per minute in mid 1990s dropped to less than a rupee by 2007 after the policy changes in 1999 and 2003. This happened with the arrival of mobile phones, so that the connection service owners were able to profitably run their business by catering to the vast untapped demand and reap the economies of scale, which resulted in sharp reduction in cost. This can easily be interpreted as the repercussions of easing the restrictive policies of the government. Let us now understand the foreign trade in services. Liberalization and removal of regulatory policies have reinforced the trend of globalization and given a spurt to the international investment and trade in services. Services like finance and insurance have become traditional complements to trade in goods. This has been aided by technological development, growth of the multinationals, and new delivery models. India's export of services has increased manifold mainly due to the global competitiveness which it enjoys in IT and ITES services. India is able to achieve the trade surplus in this segment as the demand for India's service exports has touched a remarkable level. In fact, India has a negative trade balance in services, but from 2004 onwards, it has a positive trade balance in the services. In addition to this, service exports has increased the number of well-paid jobs and employed labor in a high productivity sector. Service exports have also led to the increased tax revenues and stimulated the demand for infrastructure as well. The rapid growth in the service trade is seen in the period 1990-2010. While in 1980, India's service trade was $6 billion, which reached $240 billion in 2010. The growth rate of trade in services for India was not only higher than the India's merchandise exports, but also more than the global services exports. For the period 1980-2010, the growth rate of world's export of services was 7.84%, while that of India was 13.2%. The bulk of the growth was seen during the post-reform period of 1991 to 2010. Though the global trade in the services is dominated by the developed countries, but the emerging economies like China and India are now in the top 10 list of trading countries in the services among the WTO member countries. Recent data shows that China is the fourth largest exporter of services while India ranks 8th. India's share in the global trade of services has increased from less than 1% to over 3% in the period 1980-2010. The compounded annual growth rate of service export for the period 2001 to 2010 is 23.6%. In 2011 and 12, the export of services in absolute terms were $142.3 billion. An important fact to be noted here is that during 2006 and 7 to 2011 and 12, 38% of the trade deficit on merchandise was financed by the surplus in the service export. Next, we shall discuss about the investment in the services sector. In the pre-liberalization period, manufacturing attracted the bulk of the FDI's inflows, but after liberalization, it is the services sector which is the largest recipient of the foreign direct investment. However, the share of services in FDI is falling since 2006 and 7. FDI is allowed in India through two routes. One is the automatic route and the other is the government route. Automatic route is for the services like agriculture, mining, energy and construction, while for the single brand retail, courier services and natural gas pipeline transportation services, government route is applicable. Though the postal services and railways do not allow FDI, but it is partially allowed in air transport services, multi-brand retail and banking services. FDI policy, which is a reflection of the general economic reforms, and liberalization has led to magnificent increase. This is also due to the availability of skilled labor at low wages. A.T. Kearney Global Services ranked countries in terms of the best location for outsourcing in 2011. India was the leading one among 50 countries, followed by China. Surprisingly, the rank was highest due to the human resource, but it was 43rd in terms of the business environment. Let us understand now that the growth led by the service sector is sustainable or not. Now, we've put forward the question that whether the role played by the services in the growth process sustainable in India. Many argue that income generated in the services sector is in excess of the demand created for the services in the commodity market. This may have implications on inflation. In addition to this, the income generated might grow faster than the employment in the organized sector, so that the distribution of income may also get affected adversely. Thus, it is asserted that this kind of growth is not sustainable in future. Banga and Golder in 2004 addressed this issue by empirically studying the impact of services input on productivity growth of the manufacturing sector. Their results showed that the increase in the use of the services has favorably affected the productivity in the manufacturing sector. Their study concludes India's service sector will be successful in creating its own demand. Further, it is interesting to note that service sector has the strongest impact on the GDP compared to the other two sectors. With a unit increase in service, GDP increases by 0.634 units, while the increase in GDP is 0.084 units for a unit increase in industry and 0.202 units for a unit increase in agriculture. We can also rely on services for a sustainable growth because the average share of services in GDP during 1990s was almost the same as the global level for a country with similar per capita GDP. This emphasizes that India is not an outlier in the growth process. Further, the annual growth rate in services in India was maintained at 10% even during the global economic crisis, when the total GDP growth rate fell from 9.3% in 2007 and 8 to 6.8% in 2008 and 9. Sustainability issue can also be seen in terms of environment. Per capita CO2 emission in India has remained constant since 1980s, though there have been increase in the GDP per capita. This shows that India is growing with lesser pollution. With evolving technologies, services are tradable without any harm to the environment, and they can be easily transported via satellite without any CO2 emissions. In our view, growth process can be held by the service sector only if the service sector contributes to the productivity and efficiency of the other sectors, which requires less skilled laborers. India, being an agrarian economy, cannot ignore the agriculture sector, as half of the population is still employed in it. So, it is essentially for the agriculture to prosper in order to have inclusive growth. Now, how significantly does service sector benefit the agriculture sector is a matter of further research. If the growth in the service sector can form the linkages with the other sectors and channelize their growth as well, then we can have a compelling theory where service-led growth can be justified as an alternative growth process. Now, we will be summarizing what we have learned in this module. Service sector is the fastest growing sector in India. It is contributing significantly to the gross domestic product and the foreign direct investment inflows in India. Foreign trade in services has increased manifold after 1991. India is ranked among the top 10 WTO member countries in the export and import of services. The problematic issue is that the growth of the service has been able to generate employment in India. A large number of people in service sector are working in unorganized sector, which provides limited job security. The growth process of India led by the service sector is sustainable only if it contributes to the productivity and efficiency of the other two sectors.